talking about a revolution. Sounds a whisper. And finally the tables are starting to turn. Talking about a revolution. Yes, finally the tables are starting to turn. Talking about a revolution. Oh no. Talking about a revolution. Oh no. Talking about a revolution.
All right, everyone, we're going to get started. So thank you all again. Almost 300 folks on this webinar. We're really grateful and so excited to have you all here. We're going to get started right away. I would like to welcome Marcus Mundy, the Executive Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color, to welcome us and to share a land acknowledgement.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mira. Good afternoon again, and welcome again to the Coalition of Communities of Color, CCC's Economic Justice Community Forum. My name is Marcus Mundy. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition. And just so for some of you may not know, we're a 19-member alliance of culturally specific community-based organizations. We work mainly in the Tri-County region of Oregon, but we also do work in Vancouver, Washington, and around the state. And this report actually reflects investigating communities of color around the state. We represent African American, Asian, Latine, Middle Eastern, Native American, Pacific Islanders, and the Slavic communities. And our mission is to address the socioeconomic disparities, institutional racism, and inequity of services experienced by our families, our children, and our communities. And we approach it through collective action and social change. And so that's the by road stuff, but I would just like to profoundly thank the hundreds of you who have joined CCC today to hear the results of our racial justice inquiry, the RJI team's research on the racial wealth gap and economic justice in Oregon. And I would also like to thank the prescience, the forethought of the Oregon Community Foundation and Meyer Memorial Trust for their initial and continued funding of this important research. This is essential. It's good for Oregon, it's good for our communities, and we appreciate our partners at the foundations. But before I go any further, I do wish to share an important land and labor acknowledgement, and I will switch screens and and go ahead and read that now. And we do our work on the stolen land of the Kalapuya, Wasco, Cowlitz, Multnomah, Tualatin, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Malala, bands of Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We also live in a nation of wealth created by the subjugation and exploitation of African people brought to Turtle Island through chattel slavery, or the Mafa, which is Swahili for the Great Disaster. We uplift the original indigenous stewards of the land and the forced contributions of generations of Africans. We ground our fight knowing that there is no Black liberation without indigenous sovereignty, and there is no indigenous sovereignty without Black liberation. We fight for land back and reparations and refute settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, and imperialism. So let me switch back to my screen and my camera. And I'll just close by saying, as we reflect on that acknowledgement, and I hope we do reflect on that acknowledgement, I wish to thank you again. There's hundreds of you on this call, so I know that there's a thirst for this information, but most importantly to me, and what I hope we get out of this is not just information, it's action. You all get to share in the excellence that we see every day at CCC from our Racial Justice Institute team, from Andres, from Mira, from Kanya, and you'll see a lot of their work today. But after this exhaustive research, we believe that this report identifies issues, but also recommendations and approaches, possible solutions to this grave and gigantic disparity between populations. So I urge you to listen. I urge you to ask as many questions as you can, either today or later, once you've had time to absorb the report. And beyond that, use this carefully, clearly delineated data to help you make some organizational and individual decisions to begin to close the racial wealth gap for all of Oregon's residents. You'll have opportunities to hear about it today, and I'll leave you with one commercial. We have an event coming up on June 7th where you will hear more about the work of the Research Justice Institute. I urge you to support that event, but also to support this team who is going to share this information with you today. So with that, I'll stop talking and pass it back to Mira. And thank you very much for coming again, and we welcome all of your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for your welcome remarks and also your calls to action. I would like to now welcome my colleague, my co-conspirator, Dr. Andres Lopez. He's a research director at the Coalition of Communities of Color. Take it away, Andres.
Thank you, Mira. Welcome, everybody. I will be spending some time with you this afternoon reviewing the report before we dive into our wonderful list of speakers here today who will hopefully share more with you all. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how racist structures and policies are alive and well today, how we told the racial wealth gap story in our research, some data that supports it, a little bit about dominant approaches to addressing the gap and their limitations, investing in community-led processes, thinking about Black, Indigenous, and Latina wealth narratives, and we'll end with some recommendations. Next slide. I want to begin by sharing with you where we started in our research process. And that is with acknowledging that over generations, through laws and policies, white families have been provided with wealth starter kits that include land, government-backed mortgages and farm loans, a social safety net, and business and education subsidies. These systemic advantages have enabled white families to accumulate generations of wealth, while these same policies excluded communities of color from these opportunities. So I'll share a little bit more with you about how this is still alive and well today. So some of the examples that we provide in the report to help make this argument is thinking about the tax code, thinking about how super majority requirements, kicker rebates, for example, and the various ways that the interests and positions of those who are already wealthy, who are mostly overwhelmingly white, are supported with our current tax code and its structure. We talk about debts, fines, and fees, and the ways that BIPOC communities are criminalized, over-policed, and incarcerated, particularly Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities, and how this creates a great deal of wealth stripping for these communities and generations of indebtedness at times. We talk about financial institutions and services and their legacies, such as redlining, and how they continue to segregate and isolate Black, Indigenous, and Latino communities, which really determines their access to financial institutions and services. We also think about systemic support of land theft and labor exploitation. There is an ongoing denial and erasure of Indigenous communities and their sovereign land. We think about the systemic barriers that produce wealth on reservation lands. We think about immigration policies that also produce precarious labor conditions for Latino communities. So all of these are examples and further detailed in the report of how racist structures and policies are alive and well and shape the lives of Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities in particular. Next slide. So the way that we told the racial wealth gap story was thinking about two perspectives, one being a dominant one, and this is probably the one you're most familiar with. So thinking about the mainstream data, both nationally and in Oregon, that tells the story of the racial wealth gap. Thinking about how approaches and strategies are meant to address them and the broad implementation of them. On the other side of that, we provide a community perspective that really is grounded in BIPOC narratives and community-led data. We talk about the desired approaches and strategies of those communities, and we focus on culturally specific, cross-cultural, and dominant-led implementation. Next slide. We also wanted to provide a framework for thinking about the racial wealth gap. This is a really big topic that can be very overwhelming. So we really wanted to categorize ways so that folks could identify what is the racial wealth gap and how are folks attempting to address it. So we think of these in terms of wealth building, which really align around asset classes in many ways. We think about economic stability, which is about the conditions that need to be set in order for folks to build wealth. And then we also think about wealth stripping, which are the various ways in which wealth is stripped from communities that makes it nearly impossible at times for folks to build wealth. Next slide. In the report, we have a lot of data examples that really highlight this, but I just want to share a few with you here today that are Oregon specific. When we think of wealth building, we think about how 67% of Latino Oregonians are not covered by workplace retirement plans, compared to 43% of white Oregonians. We think about economic stability in terms around how Black Oregonians with at least a bachelor's degree earn less than $8,000 than white Oregonians with comparable education. We think about wealth stripping and often many of the ways in which we erase Indigenous lives and histories. We think of the 109 tribes that were terminated in the 1950s and how 64 of those were Oregon tribal nations. So together, the report really talks about these three specific ways in which the racial wealth gap is created and perpetuated. And we wanted to share a little bit of that with you, but hope you'll dive deeper into the report to learn more. Next slide. So ultimately here, what we want to show is that addressing the racial wealth gap ultimately would mean a wealthier Oregon. So this data from the Federal Reserve demonstrates how, as a state, addressing the racial wealth gap, or if we did not have a racial wealth gap, we would have more earnings, more employment, and more educational attainment. Next slide. So the main takeaway here that we want to share with you all is that more than any other indicator, such as level of income or education, how a person is racialized is the most important factor in understanding differential access to wealth in this country. Next slide. In the report, we also frame out what we identify as dominant approaches. So we think of tools in the sense of things that increase capacity to build wealth. We think of repair as things that redress legacies of harm. We think of protect as mitigation or eliminating harm from wealth stripping that occurs. And then we think of access as really sort of addressing the systemic barriers or leveling the playing field of how to build wealth. And the report provides more examples and details about these different categories. But this is, in our research, how we come to understand the dominant approach. Next slide. What we learned about the dominant approach was that most of them are important. Most of them are helpful in the sense that they can provide some way of addressing the wealth gap. Take this approach, for example, supporting small businesses through access to capital and technical assistance. Wonderful. We need more of that. The problem with dominant approaches is that they're insufficient because they don't consider all the other aspects that are connected to people's lives. So we heard a lot from our community members, right? That we would need more than just access to capital and technical assistance, right? That there's a likelihood of intergenerational transfer of wealth, or not a likelihood of that transfer of wealth through business ownership in our communities. That there is a great deal of credit and loan discrimination that our communities experience. That there is a lack of professional mentorship and networking. So, and these are just some of the barriers. So oftentimes with research, we think, okay, well, let's just address some of these barriers, right? That also is helpful. However, there's also community strengths and community desires. And these are even beyond these barriers. These are assets that our communities have, right? That are also not a part of these dominant approaches. So thinking about creating culturally meaningful business and utilizing the very strong networks of care and support that are already existing in our communities. We also think about desires. When we center communities' desire or understanding of wealth, then we have outcomes that are grounded in those communities, in those histories, and in those desires for the future. Next slide. I want to give some examples of these community narratives, and you'll probably hear a lot more about them today. But we heard specifically from the Black community members that we interviewed talk about a democratization of economies, which really essentially means letting Black folks create their own systems for their economies. We heard things from our Native and Indigenous colleagues with stories around regenerative economies. So thinking about the generations that are to come ahead of us, right? How do we build wealth with that in mind? And also from our Latinx colleagues, we heard a lot about workers' rights and protections, right? That these elements are essential to having sustainable and community life affirming approaches to addressing the wealth gap. Next slide. So in the report, and I'm not going to go through it here in detail, but we do talk about this less about what is the correct strategy and outcome. That's important, but also we want to talk about what is the correct process and who is part of that process right? And who gets to lead that process, right? So we really make a case for these three specific processes in the report. And we've laid out the discussion today to talk a little bit about what is culturally specific, what is cross-cultural, and what is dominant-led. And you'll hear more about that from our speakers today. Next slide. So in sum here, we have a lot of recommendations. This was a lot to pare down in a short amount of time, but we have pages of recommendations. So please dive into those. But we wanted to just name a few of these here to share with you all in this live session, such as capacity building, advocating for specific policies, wealth building strategies that are specific to what our community members mentioned in our research, updating internal organizational processes, really thinking about how you do this work differently is just as important as what you choose to do in this work. Community-led data collection strategies that are fundamental. So this approach, which was community-centered, right, really gave us a very different perspective than most people when they dive into thinking about the racial wealth gap. And then lastly, we do have a racial wealth gap equity tool. And if you can go to the next slide, we can show you that briefly, but it is in the report. And it really is just a list of questions to think about how we are making decisions about the racial wealth gap. I've taken enough time from you all today. Please dive into our report. We're here to chat with you about it. And I'll pass it back to Mira to keep us going with our program.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for so clearly and succinctly describing this research that we did that took us over a year to complete. It was big and it was complex. And I would really encourage everyone here to dive into the report, as Andre said. Okay, so we'd like to move on to the next part of this community forum, which is really inviting our colleagues and community members to share some of their experiences of doing economic justice work in Oregon. So our first group of speakers will share how culturally specific efforts are addressing the racial wealth gap across the state. And we asked our speakers to reflect on a couple of prompts, and I wanted to share those prompts here with you. So our first question to our speakers was, what economic justice efforts are you and your colleagues doing in Oregon? And our second question to the speakers is, what are your concerns about how economic justice efforts are happening and what needs to shift moving forward? So with those in mind, I am really excited to welcome our first couple, Senator Akasha Lauren Spence, who represents District 18, and Stephen Green, who is an amazing entrepreneur. So welcome and take it from here.
Thank you so much for having us. Are we facilitating this ourselves? We're the first panel, so we don't have anybody to follow. I guess we'll be setting it up. But I'll start introducing myself. My name is Akasha Lauren Spence. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the state senator for District 18. And to just jump right in and answer the first question, everything that I do is around economic justice. I believe that economic justice is the pathway to freedom. It gives us the ability to live full lives when we have our basic needs met, when we have a safety net that enables us to take risks, that enables us to do what is in our spirits to do and not just be, tied to a job or become, for lack of a better term right now, wage slaves. It's incredibly important to have the wealth, not only for yourself and your family, but for the social benefit of your community. And so to that end, my colleagues and I have, embarked upon several different economic justice initiatives, some of them being more one-time payments like the Oregon Worker Relief Fund and the Oregon Cares Fund for Black Relief and Resilience, as well as House Bill 4157, essential worker pay that would provide $600 to every Oregonian who filed the earned income tax credit this past session. And coming out of, my office, thinking about these one-time payments sometimes do a lot, but again, they're one-time payments and they're not sustainable. And so, thinking about how can we create more sustainable systems for our communities to build wealth, and worked with a coalition of over 100 plus Oregonians statewide to craft the Equity Investment Act. And that act, Senate Bill 1579, was passed, able to provide $15 million through Business Oregon to community-based organizations that are culturally responsive to provide services for home and land ownership, upskilling workforces, and small business entrepreneurship. And that is going to provide services across the state. So in our rural urban core, and ensure that we have the tools and the ecosystem with which to build wealth and to build intergenerational wealth equity. And so for me, it's about doing things that are holistic, doing things that are systems thinking, right? It's not that we can just do one thing and expect it to be the silver bullet and pursue more holistic policies. And I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you. So as I think about this work and what's kind of working and the things I'm involved in, I think one end of the spectrum is very much macro, and it's about understanding the systems that are in play and the policies that are working. I think at the end of the day, those things still need to be able to find some landing and footing on the ground. And that's where you'll oftentimes find people like myself. So I'm an economist by training, raised here in Oregon. I've been here since I was 3 months old. I'm the founder of Pitch Black. So we put on an event across the country, started here in Portland, where we highlight and introduce Black entrepreneurs to ecosystems across the country. Over the last 7 years, we've done 6 events. Thanks to COVID, we missed one. And we've been able to get almost 100 folks on stages across the country and raised almost $500,000 for those folks. And introduce them to ecosystems like Portland, Seattle, Austin, Philadelphia, and other places. And as I think about what's working, Oregon Cares Fund was a Herculean lift, and it was amazing doing that with people from across the community and traveling across the state and meeting Black-owned businesses in every corner of the state. But I also think about who was there, and I think about a lot of folks volunteered their time to be able to get that work done. And I wonder where the folks are that get paid to do this work, where they can show up some more. I think the devil's at the end of the day in the details. And when we think about the big work, it's oftentimes not innovative. It's generally grains of sand. And so I'm honored to be with you all today and be thinking about this report. But I can't not say also, this is another report, and we've had dozens of reports in my adult life. And I think about, what happens after the report is completed, what happens after we have the first state of Black Oregon, the second state of Black Oregon, what is the work that's left to be done the following weeks. And so as we get into and talking about, what are the opportunities and what are the things that can change, I'm looking forward to seeing what people come up with and where the recommendations go.
Yeah, and to that end, thank you for that, Stephen. To that end, I also want to take a point about 2 other bills that were really fundamental this session that we were able to pass, which was farm worker overtime, which was a huge economic justice lift. We know that the legacy of not paying farm workers, overtime wages, just as any other worker in this country, is rooted in racist act. That at the genesis of that bill, the majority of farm workers were Black and African American, and so our Latinx community our Latina community has inherited that exclusion, and we were able to fix that this session. We also were able to talk about and look at individuals for wrongful convictions. One of the things that we've done in the omnibus bill that was the genesis of Senate Bill 1579, the Equity Investment Act, was really look at as Dr. Andres was talking about earlier, the ways in which wealth is seeded from our communities. And it's not just to access capital, it's also in our interference with the criminal injustice system, and having, fines and fees and court fees, and et cetera, being put on us that we have to pay back, and then not being able to have any form of redress and restitution after you are imprisoned. And so this would enable, Senate Bill 1584 would provide citizens compensation for wrongful imprisonment and parole. But to the other end, one of the things that we realized with this bill and all of the other bills that we put forward is that it takes a coalition of people to put these bills forward. It is always us putting ourselves together and bringing resources together, like Stephen said, volunteering our time to create coalition to ensure that we are provided for, to ensure that we gain access to capital, that we gain access to the resources, the equities that our communities so desperately need and also deserve. And so the thing that I'm looking forward to is having my colleagues who are not people of color work alongside our coalitions to put these bills forward. It is not enough to simply be a co-chief sponsor. It is not enough to be a sponsor and to sign up when the bill is already crafted, but to think about these issues front of mind and to put them forward, because the truth is we can't do this work on our own. We didn't create this system, and we don't benefit from it. So those who do have to stand beside us arm in arm and undo the harm and do the work to create the policies that will create the better future. That is what I'm truly looking forward to, is, folks being our accomplices, our true accomplices, and using their privilege to ensure that we gain access to the resources that the state has available.
Yeah. And I think some of the things that you didn't cover that I want to make sure I cover is, we need not only community members showing up, but we need large organizations showing up. And so what does it look like for Oregon Business and Industry, the PBA, to not only do an invisible knee and be invisible for 2 years, but what does it look like for them to step into the work of building trust in community and not only highlighting good intentions, but really focusing on accountability and action to change outcomes and experiences for a focused community. As I was going through the report, I was surprised to see that, in the state of Oregon, a Black man has a 3% chance of being incarcerated, right? You have less of a chance of being on Oregon Community Foundation's board historically than going to jail. And so what does it look like for us to have representation in where these decisions are being made and where funds are being spent, instead of just volunteering our time on things like the Oregon Community Fund, Oregon Cares Fund, and also the Racial Justice Council, but also compensating people for their time, their trauma, and their talent as we look to do the work that needs to be done.
The last thing that I will say, thank you for bringing that up, Stephen. The last thing that I will say is that a lot of our foundations, and the state tends to do this as well, even with my bill, Senate Bill 1579, we are asking for our culturally responsive community-based organizations and nonprofits to do a heavy lift, to do a lot of the work, right? And in order for them to do that, we have to, enable them to build capacity. We have to enable them to pay their staff a living wage. We have to enable them to have less arduous reporting processes. Yes, we need that data to prove that these bills and these efforts work, but we need to make sure that it's accessible, that our procurement processes in the state are accessible, that we are not burdening our CBOs with work that they don't have capacity to sustain, right? It's not enough to provide for a foundation to provide a one-year grant. How about a 10-year grant that enables their longevity? And so thinking about that and really thinking about the ways in which the state is complicit in not providing for capacity building and not providing for other CBOs who are small and fledgling to grow and to sustain the work, especially in our rural communities, is it something that I definitely want to ensure that my colleagues continue to work on and and bake into our bills, bake into the policies, and bake into the rulemaking process.
Thank you so much, Senator Lauren Spence and Stephen, for sharing your experiences and your insights about both the culturally specific and responsive side of the work, as well as the dominant institution side of the work. I wanted to remind attendees, all folks here, that we are, if you have questions for Senator Lauren Spence or Stephen, please drop them in the Q&A. I see some questions in the chat too, and that's fine. We're taking stock of all of them. So thank you so much both. And we will now welcome our second couple speakers. Very happy to introduce Maribel DeLeon, Director of Microenterprise Programs at Adelante Mujeres, and Reyna Lopez, the Executive Director of PCUN. Thank you both.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having us here today. Really excited to be here. My name is Reyna Lopez. I am the President and Executive Director of PCUN, Pineros y Campesinos Unidos del Noroeste. We're based in Marion County.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maribel DeLeon, Director of Microenterprise Programs at Adelante Mujeres. We're based in Forest Grove and serve all of Washington County. And Adelante Mujeres, translated loosely, is Women Rise Up.
Great. And so today, we really wanted to just share a little bit about our thoughts. And thank you so much for the prompt. I like to really just start off, at least my introduction, as a proud daughter of immigrants. My family started to follow the migration north of farm work back in the 80s, and they came to Oregon really looking for a better life. And as a kid, I went out and picked blueberries, marionberries, cherries, and have some really great memories too doing that with my family. But it really had a very big impact on my worldview and in many ways my life's purpose. And today, that has meant that I have the honor and the privilege of being the president of PCUN, but also it has meant that I think about this topic every single day, right? I think about wealth inequality in our country and what that means to have the top 1% of wealth being concentrated in one place, right? And knowing that our movements have to be intersectional. They must be intersectional between race, between class, between gender, and that narrative needs to be there. I think about what happened at the beginning of the pandemic when farm workers, all of a sudden we were called essential. And it was really interesting to talk to the farm workers that are members of PCUN, being like, well, yeah, that's great. We're essential, but we feel disposable. And why? Because many of our farm workers are undocumented and have not been acknowledged as the backbone of the essential workforce. Because today, the vast majority of our farm workers too are indigenous people of Mexico, Central America, and many farm workers too in the South are Afro-Latinx from the Caribbean, because people across the state are literally dying to put food on our tables. People like 38-year-old indigenous farm worker from Guatemala, Sebastián Francisco Perez, who died a very tragic and preventable death due to working in extreme heat during the summer heat dome in July. And only after that were there standards that were in place. I mean, I think that for us, we really hope that his death wasn't in vain, right? That we actually learn from this and that we have strong standards for our workers in the future. And because we also know that the rate of indigenous Mexican and Central American farm worker women in terms of sexual harassment continues to rise in the fields. And this is all because people got to make money, right? And they have to endure these different conditions. When I think about the historical context of what brought PCUN to where we're at today, I want to just echo and highlight what our senator just said, and basically bringing back the history of labor and the labor movement to the farm worker exclusion of monumental labor policies that were put in place in the New Deal era reforms in the 1930s. That specifically were based on a legacy of Jim Crow laws and slavery that have been institutionalized through the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is one of the most important laws that specifically excluded domestic and farm workers from minimum wage, from overtime, and from child labor laws, as well as the National Labor Relations Act, which excluded farm workers and domestic workers from the definition of employee, which today means that farm workers and domestic workers are categorically excluded from collective bargaining and unionizing rights. And this racial discrimination is still in our books today, maintaining a subservient class, which is felt across America, across agricultural workers in the United States. And I would say that reverberates globally, but this has affected life expectancies, it's affected wages, it's affected housing, poverty levels, and violations at work, citizenship status, which has affected the quality of life of farm workers, keeping costs low for growers, but the labor exploitable. And it's been very, very well documented that these were based on race. There was an article in the New York Times that specifically said, and I quote, that Southern Democrats affected New Deal legislation in several ways. They carved out exceptions in bills regulating business, such as bills setting the minimum wage for farming and domestic service, since that was performed by in the South predominantly by African Americans. This retarded the growth of the labor movement and tried to block efforts to unionize in the South, suspectingly, rightly, that unions were a motor of racial integration, unquote. So this system of white supremacy and systems and structures that support it often try to divide and pit people against each other. And I've seen this even amongst farm workers, where there sometimes is like this other dynamic of race within the farm worker system. And all of this is in order to retain power, right? This is why relationships, building alliances based on our values, with groups like Adelante Mujeres, with groups that are here today, while acknowledging our differences, is critical to delivering systematic change for our communities. And to do that, we must have unity amongst workers, no matter what color they are. From every single race, we need to be united and we need to be strong, because divided, we're never going to create the change that we need to better our own lives. So I'll put a little pause there, and I'll let Maribel say a little bit more, and then we're going to back and forth it a little bit more.
Thank you, Reyna. And for the audience, at Adelante Mujeres, we are working to build a more just society so that by empowering Latinas to lead. And so in our programs, we have various services that are in the education, leadership, and entrepreneurship field. So I'd like to share with you all some of the economic justice programming that we offer at Adelante Mujeres. And one under the training and education is that of our Empresa Small Business Development Program. So we are helping support aspiring and existing micro entrepreneurs in Washington County. We're also helping community members in our food sovereignty programs. And so in these programs, we are teaching persons how to grow their own food using regenerative agriculture practices. We're teaching them how to harvest their own food, how to prepare nutritious meals, and we're educating the Latin families on climate justice and environmental sustainability, because we know that all of that and being healthy and wellness is all part of economic justice as well. For this work, we collaborate with other community-based organizations, universities, and government agencies to help support this work. We're also doing economic justice efforts in the area of leadership and empowerment. For example, in our health equity program, we are training and providing professional skills development to community health workers. It is just so important for us to help develop the skills of these trusted community leaders, because they are the ones that are helping us support and provide outreach to help support all of the aspects of the health disparities in our community. We also have a Chicas Youth Development Program where we're preparing the next resilient generation to be ready in topics of academics, leadership, mentorship, and a lot of other topics. And another program I'd like to mention is that of our Immigrant Solidarity Program and our Civic Leaders Program. We train community members to learn how to be civically engaged and know what their rights are, because by doing so, individuals and their families will voice their needs and they will fight for their rights, including their rights in economic justice. And finally, the last point I'd like to touch on is the efforts that we do in advocacy and the importance and the value that there is when we join coalitions such as Oregon Ready, Fair Shot for All, you know, when we're joining these coalitions and collaborating, Adelante Mujeres' participants and our team are supporting advocacy efforts. And some of these were already mentioned today in terms of some of the wins that we had in this short legislative session, but farm worker overtime pay, universal representation, transforming justice for all, organ workers relief fund, and the heat relief bill, and so many more. And so let's do this to celebrate all of the hard work of all of these community leaders and community members that help support that. With that, I'm going to ask the audience, go and visit our website at adelantemujeres.org. There's no way I can tell you about all of the work that we do, but I do want to mention that when we think about economic justice and economic justice efforts, we're looking at this holistic programming. So it's not just about how to start a business, make it profitable. It's a lot about how to, you know, how to be a parent, how to communicate with your family, how to learn, you know, about climate justice and environmental sustainability and the importance of all of that and the cycle and how it all connects to our families. Reyna?
Well, I just want to also just one more time hold up what Maribel's talked about in terms of the capacity building and the development of the people who are most directly impacted. I can't tell you how many times, like the moment that we start building worker resistance and the moment that we start talking about like literally from point A to point B, farm economics through and how labor actually is the reason why growers get wealthy off their labor, right? And how the dynamics of that impacts the worker. And once people do that, I mean, it really is a moment of taking complete empowerment of people's own lives, and by making sure that they also have the tools to organize. Today, the farm worker movement, we really see ourselves critical to the fight for racial justice. And you heard about some of the critical shifts through HB 4002, which thank you for talking about that, the farm worker overtime bill, but we cannot end there. We know this is a system and we can't stop there. We must end all exclusions of farm workers and domestic workers as well on the national level from the National Fair Labor Standards Act, which I talked to you about a little bit, the history of it and the impact that it's had from the Fair Labor Standards Act completely so that we can end the second class of our workers, but also what America's cruel immigration policies have done to our communities. Unfortunately, politicians have really low will right now, and time again, there have been broken promises, not just from Democrats, but Republicans too have broken their promises to us. And this has meant that there's 11 million, maybe probably more, daquistas, farm workers, parents, children that are left in limbo because of racism, xenophobia, and it keeps us in a system of exploitation of our bodies and in the shadows. And one of the most impactful things that could be done to transform people's lives today is legalization for 11 million undocumented folks, and a vision for the future to expand visas so that we can continue to be a country that thrives with our immigrant communities. And lastly, climate change. We must do something about climate change today. Farm workers are seeing the impacts of climate change today through wildfires, through ice storms, through heat waves, the soil becoming unfarmable, the conditions becoming unworkable. We need to protect those workers and we need to protect our communities. We need strong standards for those workers, but we also need something bigger. And we need to pass a Green New Deal that has a strong transition period for our workers and that ensures that our most vulnerable communities are included in this transition, ending our reliance on fossil fuels, making sure that we're doing everything we can do to come into the green economy, and centering unions, making sure that those jobs are union jobs so that we can have economic security in the future. I'll just close with my call to action. Join the struggle for worker justice. You can do that at pecun.org by either donating or signing up to volunteer. So thank you so much for your time. Si se puede.
And I'm just going to do this, everything that Reyna said, let's do this call to action, and it's in here. We're happy to connect with anybody who wants more information on how they can support the Latinx community in our state. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thank you so much, Maribel and Reyna, for sharing both the programmatic work that y'all do and the call for action around advocacy and policy work. It's on both fronts so much. And And I'm taking seeing a lot of love in the chat for our speakers, so I appreciate that too. The last couple that I'd like to welcome is Amber Faist, who is the Technical Assistant Program Manager at Oregon Native American Chamber, and Sky Waters, Community Prosperity Manager at Native American Youth and Family Center. So welcome both. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. I'm really excited that I'm in this conversation with Sky, because I think that so much of the work that we've been doing has been in collaboration and partnership. And so, just to highlight a couple of those work that we've been doing in partnership. So I guess I'll start. My name's Amber Faist. I'm an enrolled citizen with the Coquille Indian tribe from Southern Coastal Oregon. I serve as the TA program manager here at the Oregon Native American Chamber. We are a statewide organization serving entrepreneurs all across the state of Oregon, and now recently in Washington and Idaho as well. And I would say that, the pandemic really brought about a time for our organization where we had to double down on our efforts, triple down on our efforts. And we wouldn't have been able to do so without the collaboration and partnership of all of the organizations that we're working with. We've really developed a collaborative TA program, one that seeks to leverage resources for entrepreneurs across the state and, not duplicate efforts, frankly. So one of our collaborations is the RISE Collective, which was funded through the Wells Fargo Open for Business grant. These are services throughout Oregon serving Latine and Native and rural entrepreneurs. And partners include NEA, HMC, the Burns Paiute Tribe, Nikiawe Community Financial Services in Pendleton, New Valkyrie, Puerto de la Familia, HMC, High Desert Partnership, Launchpad Baker, and NEO EDD. And this work really is built on assisting entrepreneurs, whether it's their startup businesses or existing businesses. A lot of this work has been mitigating the effects of the pandemic, and it really includes assistance and referrals that are kind of outside traditional business development. Things like, tax preparation and financial education, ensuring that folks have legal protections in place, helping them set personal and business budgets so that they can reach their goals, connecting individuals to wraparound services or other social services should they need them. And then, our most popular program, assisting with digital marketing, not limited to websites, branding, strategy, trainings, all of that. And another, approach to our work has been working through Prosper Portland's Inclusive Business Resource Network, which is where, we really, I feel like we're given the opportunity to build capacity and partnership in working collaboratively with partners across the city to serve underrepresented entrepreneurs here. And I think, I'll let Sky kind of maybe talk a bit more about that, but it was also where, we first released our One Coalition, our One program. It's a 8-week business development course told through the stories and experiences of Native entrepreneurs from here in Oregon. It's led by us, and it's content that's created specifically for Native community. So I think I'm gonna let Sky jump in now and maybe talk a little bit about some of the economic justice efforts that they've been up to.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sky Waters, he, him pronouns. I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation and Community Development Manager at the Native American Youth and Family Center, or NEA for short. Urban Native Americans continue to fight for self and community identity, resisting the assimilate or die message that many grew up with. NEA's economic justice efforts are focused on bringing the Native community together and creating a thriving place of Native businesses, cultural events, and community resources within the Coquille neighborhood in Northeast Portland. NEA co-owns 3 affordable housing developments in Coquille. And with these 3 properties, we will add 165 units. All of these are located within 1.5 miles of NEA's campus, providing easy access to NEA's continuum of services. But we all know housing alone is not enough. And we have been very intentional about bringing on and creating new economic opportunities. In January 2020, NEA integrated a small nonprofit, our 42nd Avenue. And through this transition, NEA now manages roughly 24,000 square feet of commercial retail space. So with this experience and along with the Coquille community relationships that we have built, it has allowed us to take on bigger and more innovative projects. One of which is a native arts incubator. And we're currently in the process of signing a lease on a retail storefront adjacent to our newest housing development, Mamuk Tokati. And we plan to use this space as a business incubator and retail selling opportunity for both artists living in the affordable housing complex and other native entrepreneurs. We think by coupling a generous on-ramp period with business technical assistance on site, vendors and artists will increase their chances of retail success. Another project we've been working on is the PCC Opportunity Center located at 42nd in Killingsworth. NEA has been collaborating with Portland Community College and Home Forward on the redevelopment of this site. Home Forward is building 84 units of affordable housing and is leasing out the first floor retail space to NEA. And within this space, NEA will bring childcare services to the Coquille community. And this was made possible through the state's ARPA process. NEA and Home Forward were able to secure $3.1 million to build this out. And finally, we're really working on this cultural corridor idea. So we have all of these new projects and initiatives that are happening within the Coquille community and got funding from the city to build public art in front of our affordable housing complexes, NEA's campus, and really connecting them all together and really having that sense of place for our Native community members. And we really want to ensure that Coquille is a place of belonging and support for Native people. And by celebrating and fostering that Native culture, we can resist the systems and policies that have attempted to erase Native identity over the years. And I'll turn it back to you, Amber.
Thanks, Sky. I think this also brings to mind all of the advocacy work that we've been doing in partnership, and ONAC's Executive Director, James Allen Parker, who was unable to join the call today. He's been serving as the co-chair for the Community Chamber Coalition of Oregon, which seeks to raise shared policy priorities through partnership with other chambers of color here in the metro region. And I think that, when we talk about these corridors and these spaces and creating, areas in the city that, are identifiable for our community and are a place of belonging, I think, it's just a huge gap across the state, frankly. And so, I'm looking forward to a time where I can go somewhere in Portland and feel like it is a Native cultural center. It is a place for a Native community to gather. And I think it's going to take a lot of work for us to get there. When I think about, some of the concerns around how economic justice efforts are happening and things that need to shift, that it really brings to mind the disparities that are existing, really across the state, as well as here in the metro region. And in general, Oregon has a long history of the erasure of natives, Native communities here, actually in the state. And, speaking from my own personal experience, coming from a rural community where there is association with, a casino and a very small subset of individuals in an area, I'm not able to frankly return home because of lack of economic opportunity in Coos County, right? So I think when we're talking about building these spaces for community and we're talking about representation, is really important, I think, to also think about, how we're supporting these efforts across the state. And Sky mentioned, one of their housing developments in partnership with the Siletz tribal Indian tribe. And frankly, that's exactly what I would love to see just continuing to happen across the state, is these types of partnerships with community-based organizations that are doing this work. But in order for those CBOs or for nonprofits to be able to do this work, we really need to have that capacity support to ensure that we have staff time to serve in this advocacy capacity, that we have staff time to support this collaborative work, that we are able to continue the work in building the capacity of our partner organizations that we work with, and that we can actually develop our own systems internally to be able to track our data, to be able to share our data and all of the great work that we're doing in a meaningful and responsible way. Sky, I'm gonna let you hop back in here.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. So yeah, I guess for me, just two big things on like concerns with the economic justice efforts. One of which is just our response to the pandemic and really making sure the recovery is equitable. And we are really using all of the resources that have come online and are available to really push forward some innovative and bold work. And we don't kind of just move back to, the status quo. And then the other piece is just, and I said it in my first answer, of really needing to fund both housing and economic development opportunities. The housing crisis has gotten so bad that has tended to drown out all other opportunities. And I work in economic development, and it has been very challenging to fund some of the initiatives and projects that I just highlighted. So really wanting, and not saying one is better than the other, but that we need to do both and fund both to the maximum that we can.
And if I have just one more second, I think there's one more point. As we're looking forward as an organization, we're looking at what economic opportunities are coming, specifically in infrastructure and clean energy and, the food systems, land management. A lot of these things are top priorities for us as we're looking at developing businesses and how we're supporting businesses so that we have community readiness to be able to benefit from those economic opportunities. And so, that's something that we're really looking at, and how we can, leverage different funding opportunities and resources, because Native entrepreneurs actually account for the most underrepresented community in terms of business ownership in Oregon. And so when we look at, whether it be construction or contracting or procurement opportunities, we don't have the businesses to tap to be able to move into these spaces. And so ONAC, we were funded and were awarded, we're now the American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian M.B.A. Center here. And we're really looking at, developing these businesses and helping assist, so that we can hopefully create an ecosystem where we have that regeneration of local money, and that we are supporting our tribal economies, and that we're able to access all of these opportunities that are coming. So.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you, Sky, so much for, again, sharing your experiences and the work that you all do. I I wanted to just thank all of the speakers that we've heard from so far, who have really brought insight and shed light on the ways in which economic justice work has been is moving forward in culturally specific ways, as well as, and this, I heard this come up a lot, is through coalition work and partnerships, and how that is really also an important piece of the story of how this work can be impactful. So again, thank you to our speakers. We have, I'm really excited to invite our next speaker. Find my notes here. Carlos David Garcia, who is the Executive Director of Neighborhood Partnerships. And Carlos, along with the speakers who I'll introduce next, are really going to be sharing some cross-cultural and cross-sector, as well as dominant institution efforts towards addressing the racial wealth gap in our state. So welcome, Carlos.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, everyone. My name is Carlos David Garcia. I use he, him pronouns, and I have the privilege to serve as the Executive Director at Neighborhood Partnerships. We're a statewide organization working to create an Oregon where we all have the opportunity, stability, and what we need to thrive. For us, this really begins with having stable, affordable place to call home and financial well-being. I want to extend my thanks to Dr. Andres Lopez and Dr. Mira Mohsini and the rest of the Research Institute and CCC team for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I want to take a pause and just acknowledge the body of work that the CCC has created and shining light on the racial disparities in wealth. My hope is that this community-driven research really is a catalyst for meaningful community-informed policy changes. There has been so many nuggets mentioned in the report and so many offerings for advocates, for nonprofits, for private and public sector to learn from and implement into our work. And I think the report really does provide a blueprint and a framework for how we might move the needle on advancing economic justice in Oregon. So please help me in giving some virtual love to the CCC team for all this work. As I prepared my comments today, today's presentation, I reflected on the invitation about talking about economic justice. And I think it's important to lift up the fact that that requires all of us to show up differently, especially those with power and influence, in ways that really center race equity and those most impacted. One of the recommendations from the report was that organizations must do our own work, our own organizational work to support equity. From Neighborhood Partnerships, this has meant a commitment by our organization to be an anti-racist organization, to center race equity both internally and externally as a practice, transforming how our organization works and operates. And I'm proud of the intentional work our team has done to commit to building a more equitable Oregon. This work has been intentional. At times it's been hard and comfortable, but also at times extremely fun, energizing, and connecting for our team, building trust in a common language and understanding of how we are headed together to a vision that we want. This is yet another invitation for our organizations, but especially for more dominant organizations, for how we show up to the work differently that really works to advance housing and economic justice. As Andres in the report mentions, more than any other factor, such as level of income or education, how a person is racialized is the most important factor in understanding the differential access in wealth in this country. And that's why we need to center race equity in our work. For MP, this has meant we've shifted on our focus on how we do our work to get to the solutions we want. Our work increasingly is focused on centering the voices of those most impacted by race, systemic oppression, and harmful policy responses to make sure that they're at the decision-making table from the get-go. It's through this work that in early 2020, MP helped create and now co-convenes the Oregon Economic Justice Roundtable. The roundtable was formed to co-create a shared table for advocates, nonprofits, funders, to advance collective and sustained action for economic justice. Our challenge is to enact bold and liberatory vision that is community-centered and will guide and support racial and economic justice. We seek to root a culture and community in Oregon that nourishes a sense of belonging, respect, and dignity among and between communities and people. We seek to create an environment and systems of abundance by and for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and all other communities of color so that all Oregonians live beyond the basics of safety and security and into the freedom to actualize their dreams. This group came together after several of us met to discuss the need for a space and a conversation around economic justice, to share what we individually are doing and how we could collectively come together to support our work, to think about how we come together in a way that would get us to a different results, to ground and design our work toward racial and economic justice, centering the expertise and leadership of BIPOC leaders. In June of 2020, we had our first meeting and the Oregon Economic Justice Roundtable was formed. 2 years later, we've continued to co-develop with our community partners, many of which are on today's call and have supported this report. Overall, I think the goal was to challenge ourselves and our colleagues to imagine new ways of doing our work and doing our business, to think about a movement that recognizes and just redistributes power and resources so that communities of color are at the center of building economic justice in Oregon. That reimagining and redistribution is even more important now, and our opportunities for change seem much larger. We know that doing business in the same way will lead us to the same outcomes and continue to perpetuate racism, white supremacy, and racial inequalities. And this report I think is a very clear example of what's possible and provides a glimpse of the potential and possibility that's unleashed when economic justice emerges from communities and when communities determine and define what success looks like and how it's measured. With that as a starting point, the roundtable has been busy the last couple of years developing our convenings, our meeting structure, and we have quarterly convenings to bring our community together and have a standing steering committee and several work groups working on issues highlighted and prioritized by our community. From the start, we have also been wanting to be intentional about how we come into community and how we come into a space together, and have begun to outline our guiding principles that would support our vision for economic justice, which are equity and racial justice, intersectionality, community-driven solutions, tackling root causes, so fixing systems, not people, and lastly, the collective action and working together. And as we've been working to activate our guiding principle, we've come together and build the community and are putting these practices into working on putting these practices forward. So what that has looked like is really centering the expertise and experience of BIPOC community leaders. We aim to have a 50+1% BIPOC space where we prioritize decision-making by communities of color. We've really tried to hone in and build and focus on developing and strengthening trust-based relationships within our group. And really working toward creating action steps that lead to different outcomes for our work. Last summer, we came together to ask our community what would be helpful and supportive for this group as we work with, and 3 big priorities came and is what we heard from our community. One is around, and we've created 3 work groups that are working on these issues. The first is an economic justice policy work group. So again, working to create and advance an economic justice policy agenda at the state capitol with the community-centered and grounding principles as our foundation. We have an organizing and power building work group, again, tasked with thinking about how we focus on organizing bringing new folks and new organizations and leaders, and to bring people together to work cooperatively and collectively for our collective vision for economic justice. And the last is our narrative work group, which is working on creating a BIPOC-centered community of practice to identify harmful narratives and co-create and activate new narratives that will support economic justice. We know that narratives, and the report mentions this, are deeply embedded in our culture and our institutions and social practices, and can play a positive role in understanding the problems that we're trying to solve for and what solutions are possible. Narrative change is a cornerstone to achieving the transformative policy changes and culture shifts that we seek. And so together with our partners, we've been developing a cohort model to really develop a community-centered narrative process that would work over 12 to 18 months with community members being centered to really think about what possible narratives we can come up with that are centering our communities. We're currently finalizing our request for proposal for our project coordinator, and we'll be soliciting proposals. So we'll ask anyone who's interested, who knows somebody who might be interested in that position, to look back at our website, and we'll be updating that soon and including that proposal. So my call to action is I invite you all to get involved, to help us organize towards economic justice, and to sign up and get updates if you're not already doing that, and attend our next quarterly convening. I'm going to go ahead and include our website where folks can get signed up. My colleague Ethan Livermore, our economic justice organizer, will be happy to follow up with folks and get them plugged in. And again, deep appreciation to the CCC for this body of work, and I'm excited to continue working together to advance economic justice in our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, so much for sharing the work of the Oregon Economic Justice Roundtable and really modeling for us what community-centered, community-led work can be, especially in a coalition space. So next, I will be welcoming our foundation partners. First, I would like to welcome Nancy Ramirez Arriaga, Building Community Program Officer at Meyer Memorial Trust, and D'Artagnan Kalaman, Justice Oregon for Black Lives Portfolio Director at Meyer Memorial Trust. Welcome both.
Thank you, Mira. My name is Nancy Ramirez Arriaga. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I serve community through my role as a program officer at Meyer Memorial Trust, a statewide funder. I'm joining this virtual conversation from the land of the Kalapuya. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and to the Coalition of Communities of Color for giving us some space here in this conversation, and for the partnership overall to for this report. Pleased to be here with everyone. So in the spirit of showing up and how we show up, talking about just the power that we hold, I think it's important to recognize that philanthropy as a sector has benefited from the extractive history of the US that has created this racial wealth gap. And for all of us in progressive philanthropy, I think it's also important that we listen and that we really sit with the tension as we move through transformation, because we are doing that, and that's why we're here. So the short answer to the question about what we're doing to address the racial wealth gap really is that we're just getting started. But I also want to answer the question by sharing a little bit about Meyer's journey towards this beginning. So Meyer's grant making and regional investment history does demonstrate support for the levers of economic stability and economic advancement. Efforts include supporting the growth of the emergent regional investment field back in 2000. So we started this work of creating access to capital back then. And most recently, since our 2016 restructure through our grant making portfolios that support equitable education and affordable housing, are examples of how we support important levers for individual economic stability and advancement. But over these last 6 years, we have also remained committed to learning. So I want to talk a little bit more about that journey that actually gets us from supporting economic stability and advancement to economic justice. So through the Building Community Portfolio, a non-sector specific portfolio, we began to shift away from our direction that we had starting in 2016 of offering general sector support and shifted more towards a framework focused on social, political, and economic justice. Under this framework, we really sought to support the efforts aimed at addressing root causes of inequity and injustice at a systemic level. At the same time that we shifted towards this framework, we also championed a shift from Meyer's 2016 initial focus on equity to a racial justice focus. And we began to clearly state that the portfolio's practice to center communities of color, immigrants and refugees, and Indigenous people and tribes in our grant making. So this recognizing that social, political, and economic justice are inextricably linked, that we need to focus on systems change work, and that we need to center racial justice really resulted in more support for advocacy work, movement work, coalition work, and culturally specific work along the continuum of economic justice. These two shifts at the portfolio level, lifting economic justice as an area of focus and centering racial justice as a practice, are markers on our institutional journey. And the anchoring at the intersection of racial and economic justice is a product of ongoing learning, struggle, as I said, holding tension, dialogue, and practice. So with this work and our collective commitment has since informed Meyer's first of a kind 5-year, $25 million culturally specific initiative, which you will hear a lot more about from my colleague D'Artagnan. It has resulted in a cross-funder supported network of Latinx leaders committed to community level wealth building. And that is a collaboration with the Latino Partnership Program at the Oregon Community Foundation and with the Collins Foundation. This work also prepared us for our engagement as a founding and active steering committee member of the Oregon Economic Justice Roundtable that you heard about from my colleague Carlos Garcia. And most recently, as you might have seen, this journey in our work is reflected in Meyer's new mission to accelerate racial, social, and economic justice for the collective well-being of Oregon's lands and people. So when I say that the work is just beginning, is because now comes the hard task of bringing the learning to life, institutionalizing it. But that being said, we're going to continue to integrate community voice. It will be key as we continue this work. And I am grateful to be here and to have some of the partners that contributed to the Wealth Gap to their experience about the wealth gap in Oregon for the report, and everybody who shared about their work with us today. So I'm going to hand it over to D'Artagnan, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you to our partners over at CCC. Good afternoon. I am D'Artagnan Kalaman. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a 6th generation Oregonian. I grew up in Northeast Portland, but recently returned back to Portland and started working with Meyer Memorial Trust to lead Justice Oregon for Black Lives in January of 2021. One of the things that Nancy talked about is that at Meyer, we've had this progression of work as it relates to our impact around addressing racial equity and anti-racism, as well as within the space of economic justice. And so one thing I would say is that for us, what's new is that we have a new mission at Meyer Memorial Trust, which is Meyer accelerates racial, social, and economic justice for the collective well-being of Oregon's lands and peoples. And so for example of this, as Nancy mentioned, our new initiative, Justice Oregon for Black Lives, was launched in June of 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. We have an initial investment of $25 million over 5 years to support Black liberation and resilience. One of the things I will mention is that as we have tried to live within trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant making and really centering community voices in where we're making our investments, this is absolutely what we've tried to do with Justice Oregon for Black Lives. So we have an advisory committee made up of community leaders of about 35 to 40 Black leaders throughout the state. Initially, we have invested $3 million to 34 organizations in the year 2021. The year 2022, we have invested $4.8 million into 49 different Black-led, Black-serving organizations. And within this work, we have centered our work under 5 strategic priorities. Investing in education, economic justice that we're here talking about, reimagining public safety, shifting the Black narrative through arts and culture, and addressing trauma and healing for Black community. All of these strategic priority areas and their goals and outcomes have been set with community, in partnership with community. And so as we continue to do our work within economic justice, we're focused around a couple key goals and outcomes. They're increasing Black home ownership. They're also about increasing Black-owned businesses, as well as increasing those businesses to a revenue of 1 million plus for 100 Black businesses throughout the state of Oregon. And they are about increasing financial education and literacy for Black community. So those are some of the things we're doing with Justice Oregon for Black Lives, and I will turn it back over to Nancy.
And I think that's our time. So I will let Mira guide us. Thanks, D'Artagnan.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Mira.
Thank you so much, D'Artagnan and Nancy. We at the CCC, we've had a really wonderful relationship with Meyer and really appreciate much of this work being collaborative with Meyer, as well as with the Oregon Community Foundation, who also supported this work. And I'm happy to invite our colleagues from OCF. I'd like to welcome Mirna Loreli Ciprian, Program Officer, Latino Partnership Program at the Oregon Community Foundation, and Melissa Freeman, Director of Initiatives and Partnerships at the Oregon Community Foundation. So welcome both.
Gracias, Mira. Thank you. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mirna Loreli Cibrian. As Mira just mentioned, my pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am the program officer for the Latino Partnership Program at OCF. Melissa, would you like to do a quick intro before we dive in?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. My name is Melissa Freeman. I'm the Director of Initiatives and Partnerships at the Oregon Community Foundation out of the Portland office, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you, muchas gracias to the Coalition of Communities of Color's Research Justice Institute for this report and for inviting OCF to this community forum. Thank you so much. And so in a moment, you're gonna hear from my colleague Melissa Freeman a little more. But first, I wanted to take a moment to specifically talk about the Latino Partnership Program efforts in the space of wealth building. And so for a little context setting, LPP is a statewide program that's specifically focused on the Latinx community or Latina community in Oregon. We do this work with community and for community, and are intentional about centering the voices and experiences of the Latino community across Oregon in our partnerships and our grant making efforts. And so I wanna begin on follow up to a comment that Nancy made in regards to the Latinx community wealth building partnership that we've had as one example of some of the work that we're doing in this space. So in 2019, we began convening this community wealth building network to talk about wealth. And as funders, we realized it was going to be important to do some of that initial legwork for folks to have space and capacity to come together. And so I would say that after some time, the network produced a report with recommendations actually to philanthropy for wealth building work from a Latinx perspective, which we're happy to share again if you haven't seen it. And so, you know, the leaders have been voicing and elevating the importance of community-led solutions. And in fact, some of these leaders helped inform this report as well that we're here to learn more about today. The Latino Community Network is, I would say, an example of community-led work. And for us as funders, it has become increasingly important to collaborate, work in partnership with other community leaders and foundations, honestly. And so, like Nancy mentioned, today, alongside with Meyer and Collins Foundation, LPP, the Latino Partnership Program, is resourcing this network to support a community-led approach to this work. And so as a result of all the community engagement work and honestly, all the learnings that we are doing at this moment, the Latino Community Wealth Building Network have been true partners to this work. And as a result, we have updated, we meaning the Latino Partnership Program, we've updated our strategic plan. And in our priorities now, it includes wealth building as an area to take a deeper dive into. Along other priorities include education and leadership development. And we know they're all interconnected. So I would say we're leaning into this space, recognizing that we have a lot of work ahead, a lot of road to cover. And as philanthropy, we don't have all the answers. This is where our community partnerships and community-centered approaches to this work will make a difference moving forward. We, with LPP, we have statewide presence, like I mentioned. We have committees across the state that help lead our work in the regions. And so we are looking forward to providing opportunities for nonprofits to apply for small grants in relation to wealth creation. And honestly, one other thing that we hope to do is share also everything we're learning across the state in regards to the Latino community. I'm going to stop there because I'm looking at time and I want to give some time for my colleague Melissa to share, but thank you. Melissa?
Okay, thank you, Myrna Lorelli. It's so nice to be here again. And I am just really pleased to be able to share my support and the foundation's support for this important report that CCC put together. I think all of you will find the literature review really documents the ways in which our current and historical policies have failed low-income people and people of color for generations. And you will see in there that they have some very specific examples, and it helps people who may not know as much about this topic as others to really understand the fear and the mistrust of government and banks and institutions that are led predominantly by Caucasian people and how it persists. So please do read the report if you can. It's been an important document for us to discuss and learn both among staff and board members. And I just want to emphasize that Myrna has been out in front with Nancy, really cultivating a wonderful infrastructure of community-led groups who are leading the way for OCF in terms of thinking about what does wealth building mean to them, and then figuring out how the foundation can support it. And this document and the information, the data that's available will really help us at OCF increase our support and learn about new strategies that we haven't yet funded. I'll just emphasize a couple of examples because we have been working on economic stability and wealth building since at least 2010 when we took on economic vitality as a strategic priority. And most of our work has really emphasized increasing access to capital for small underrepresented business owners, small businesses. Through our loan program, we've provided over $12 million in loans to CDFIs, community development financial institutions that provide loans to folks who have difficulty accessing traditional bank financing. So we have our Oregon Impact Fund, which provides loans for those types of intermediaries. And then we also have provided about $12 million in lending to spur affordable housing development, to increase home ownership, particularly for low income and folks who are coming from different cultural communities in Oregon. So those are just a couple of the examples. I also love the emphasis on coalition building and have been really pleased to see the passage of House Bill 4117, which is going to enable the state to invest $4 million into the tax support system to help more people who are eligible access the earned income tax credit and child tax credit. And those are mentioned in the report as strategies for economic stability and poverty reduction. And we're pleased to be a proud supporter of that coalition. So anyway, I know we're out of time, but just really thankful for the report, thankful for our partnership with Meyer Memorial Trust and the Coalition of Communities of Color on this effort, and look forward to hearing from all of you too about, get in touch with us about your ideas for how we can do more. We're just starting to lean into this space and appreciate your ideas and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Myrna, for sharing the work that OCF is doing. I wanted to thank all of our amazing speakers for sharing their knowledge and wisdom with us about the economic justice work that's happening across the state. We're now ready for some Q&A. So I would like to invite all of our speakers to turn on their videos so folks can see everyone on one screen. And we have some questions that have come through that I will just, I'll just ask folks, and whoever would like to answer, please feel free to do so. We had a question early on about, this is related to narratives, and it was recounting a story about working with underserved communities, and how this person would communicate with folks using social media and phones, and their colleague was like, aren't they underserved? Why do they have social media? Why do they have phones? Aren't they underserved? So it's this idea that underserved, there's a narrative about what underserved looks like, just like there are narratives about what wealth looks like. So there's a lot of narrative work, I feel, that is so critical to advancing programmatic efforts, policy efforts towards addressing the racial wealth gap. So my question to y'all is, what are the narratives that you are hearing from the communities that you work with, and how can this emphasis on narrative work help us address the racial wealth gap? This is open to anyone who'd like to answer that question.
I'll just jump in real quickly and say the more dialogue we can have, the better. People are learning, they come from different experiences, different backgrounds, different contexts. And so the more we can have dialogue about people's experiences and their lives, the more people will understand. I agree with you. It's too bad that so many stereotypes persist. And that's one of the things that I love about the Oregon Community Foundation, is being a convener with various communities and community leaders, community members all across the state.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big questions that we've been asking ourselves as we think about this question, and really think about how narratives are showing up and what are the harmful narratives that continue to show up. And I think in our work, that as we've convened and talked about how narratives interplay, there's a lot of harmful narratives around personal responsibility, like this idea of like pulling yourself up by their bootstraps, and that's grounded in a lot of policy and practice, and how we talk about who's deserved and who is not. And that is really woven in and baked into a lot of racism and white supremacy like culture that has dictated who is deserving and who isn't deserving. So I think part of the goal through the Our Narrative project is to really uncover the narratives that are truthful, that are in fact reality, about the abundance and the community-centered approaches and the livelihood of folks of color, that aren't stereotypical and really grounded in truth and reality. So I think there's a lot to uncover there when it comes to narratives, and those are just some of the big ones that we see that we have to try to combat and work toward. And again, the goal is like, how do we then have a counter narrative that illustrates that abundance in our community?
Yeah, and I just want to double click on that, Carlos. Thank you for sharing that. narrative work is so important. You know, it falls in the space of social justice work, and just the importance of recognizing how one thing builds on the other. As you're saying, what are the narratives about who is deserving, and how do we move economic justice? And those narratives really, you know, are what hold policy in place, either the passing or the sustaining of policy. And so narrative work is really critical for so many different reasons in this work.
Also punctuate that the narrative work
Did she freeze for anybody else?
I think we lost the senator for a moment. I was really, really excited to hear that end of that sentence. Would anyone else, while we wait for the senator to come back?
Are you able to hear me?
You froze for a minute, but we can hear you now.
Connection is unstable, so I apologize. Yeah, so one of the books that I give out to all of my legislative colleagues is All About Love, New Visions by Bell Hooks. And that is a powerful tool to provide them with a narrative of what economic justice looks like, of what justice in general in the public sphere looks like through a love ethic, and how it becomes tangible in policy. And so to me, narrative work can't just come from, you know, forums like this. It has to come in our literature. It has to come in the stories that are told about the work that we're doing. So our press, you know, one of the things that I talk about often is how are our stories being reported on, right? How is our story being disseminated through a public lens? People who would never meet any of us, right? That's important. How are we being made in the mass media? So in movies, in television, in dramas. So it's not just going to be the work of us here in this coalition. It's going to be the work of everybody in our community, especially our artists, especially our creatives, especially those who are telling our stories.
Yeah, I think, you know, James Earl Jones said it the best. There's only one thing in life that gets bigger over time, everything else dissipates, and that's stories. So we have to get our stories out there, and we have to be mindful of the words that we use. And you know, one of the things I'd love for us to get a better grasp on and be cognizant of is how we associate communities of color with low income, and how they're oftentimes used interchangeably. How do we, you know, educate ourselves and tell the stories of a broader existence of communities of color that may be low-income folks, but also very oftentimes are past being low-income and experiencing a lot of different things as well.
I'd like to add on the topic of telling our stories is getting more of our community members involved to tell their own story, right? So those of us who are in the nonprofit sector, we're often called on to be that support, to be that voice, but how can we help develop our community members, develop their leadership skills so that they're present in all of these tables where, you know, persons are making decisions without understanding really who are our communities of color. That's why leadership programs like, you know, the ones led by Unite Oregon, Unidos leadership training, Capaces, those with Adelante Mujeres, et cetera, are so important because we are providing training that's culturally responsive to teach our community how to be civically engaged and how to fight for justice so that they go out there and really represent who their community is. And like in the example that was given in this Q&A of that very specific group, who's involved in that group, right? Like, do they have diversity in that group to really understand who is the community that they're around? So definitely need to encourage more community members to serve in leadership roles, but there is a lot of challenges and barriers within that itself. So how can we help support them in that way?
Yes, thank you all for sharing some perspectives on narratives and then uplifting the power of stories. It's incredibly important, and we really wanted to have this work highlight some of that. And I just also want to say that, you know, to Stephen's point earlier, that ultimately this is a report, right? And ultimately we need action to come out of this report, and hopefully those not just relying on the mainstream data to tell the story, but having our people tell the story is really, really critical to meaningful action. I wanted to end, we just have 8 more minutes together. So I thought we could do, if all of our speakers could reflect on this for a second and share your responses to this, we thought, let's end on a positive note. Let's end on, let's think about why do you believe it's possible to address the racial wealth gap? Or what are the possibilities that you see in your day-to-day work for addressing the racial wealth gap?
I'll kick it off. I think the things that give me hope is, one, as communities of color, we're really connected here in Oregon, more so than other places that I've lived. We've got more than 6,000 Black-owned businesses. That number has tripled in the last 10 years. We've got more than 13,000 Latinx businesses across the state. Black women are our fastest growing demographic when it comes to business owners here around the state. And it's never been cheaper than right now to start and scale a business. So, you know, what happens when we have more folks getting engaged in the work beyond volunteering, and we really see philanthropy, the public sector, the private sector really come to bear fruit to the amazing work and fortitude of the folks that are already doing it.
Mira, can I jump in? I would say that specifically, I think talking about the Latino Partnership Program and the work at OCF, I think we're excited along with our statewide council members, which are thought partners to our work, and our committees across the state, to continue to explore on what kinds of opportunities there are to continue to support our community, but not just the Latino community, other BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous. What does that look like for the state in terms of real sustainable long-term support in the state of Oregon? And honestly, looking ahead, how do we leverage, right, what's happening on the ground that's being led by community and for community? And how do we work collaboratively, you know what I meant, with other philanthropic institutions and others? For example, the work that we've been doing with Meyer over there with Nancy and the team.
This is D'Artagnan, and I'll jump in quickly to say what gives me inspiration and hope is that we know and believe and trust that the community knows what it needs. And so for those who are most marginalized and under-resourced, the most important piece is shifting power back to them and supporting with the resources that are needed.
This is Carlos. I'll just go ahead and echo that. I think we've seen the power and magic that happens when those most impacted are the ones at the driver's seats providing the solutions. And we see that through the work that we're doing with residents organizing for change, for informing some of the housing policy work that we're doing, and just inspired tremendously by the work and passion and care that these community members are bringing to this conversation. And I'm glad to see all of the different ways in which that's happening throughout our organizations and our institutions, which I think we need more of.
I would just continue to echo that, hearing especially from our community partners today about how much community power they're building. And we know the working poor and working class community have always been strong, and that they are the ones that will lead us to the solutions that we just need to walk towards and continue supporting. And I think also the ways that we continuously strive to stretch ourselves from places of privilege to really acknowledge that privilege and to partner differently and further, and also to influence each other in our sector, as well as, you know, to continue learning and following the community.
Oh, Melissa, do you want to go?
Go ahead, Sky.
Yeah, I'll just share a project that we're currently working on that's kind of bringing inspiration to me and is also, I think, kind of highlights a lot of what folks have talked about on this question. We're currently in a coalition of about 7 nonprofit organizations. It's NEA, Hacienda, the Coquille Association of Neighbors, Verde. I'm missing a few, but it's a broad-based coalition, and we're really coming together to rethink what a tax increment financing district could look like, and particularly one in the Coquille neighborhood. So this has been like a 4-year process, and really there's been a lot of intentionality on having it be community led. TIF has had very disastrous results in the past and used to displace communities of color. And we're trying to flip that on its head, where now it's written into the charter of this community-led TIF that it should prevent displacement and create economic opportunities for our most vulnerable community members. So that's something that I'm really excited about, and it's going to unlock, if we can pass it. We're still in the middle of kind of working on this, but it will unlock tens of millions of dollars to create economic and housing opportunities in the Coquille community.
I was just going to say quickly that what gives me hope is watching the people who have been rebuilding their communities, particularly down in Southern Oregon after the 2020 fires. I just want to give a shout out to those families. I have seen people come together in ways that I've never imagined possible, and they have been stripped of everything, and they are coming together and trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives. And so I just ask all of you to please continue to hold them in your hearts. That we're 2 years out and people are still trying to rebuild and recover, and that's happening across the state.
I know we're out of time, but I think seeing all of these cross-cultural connections and collaborations and cohesion around the work that's being done is really inspiring to me. And I think it's reports like this one that really illuminate the opportunities that are within our grasp in terms of supporting each other and the work that we're all doing in partnership. So that makes all of this feel really possible and real.
The thing that gives me hope is looking at over the past 2 years when our state was able to see a cash infusion of CARES dollars, of ARPA dollars, et cetera. The ways in which we use that money, we used as extra funds, was to listen to community and provide those community-based resources that we so desperately need. And so realizing that there is some political capital, some political will to do the work once we have the money. And so the possibilities are looking at our tax reform system and doing the work to reform our tax code so that we have those dollars to continue to, and that we, change the face of our state by continuous long-term investments and not one-time funds, not standing up programs that will not be able to be sustainable, but to do that work. And so seeing the political will to do that and understanding that the health of our community is tied to every one of us. Nobody that's going to be healthy if one of us is lacking. And I think that more and more Oregonians are starting to believe that and understand that. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Well, thank you all so much for ending us on this note. And before I pass it over to Marcus very quickly, who will close us out, I will just like to say that we have all of your questions. We weren't able to get to all of them, and we will. We'll also be sharing a link to this recording via our YouTube channel. And we will also be sharing the slides that Dr. Lopez presented earlier for you all, for everyone who attended. So again, thank you so much to our speakers. This has been a wonderful forum community event, and I'll just hand it over to Marcus Mundy to close us out. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mira. And thank you everybody who participated today, both. I mean, if you look at those numbers, we still have 200 people that were with us from start to finish. And that is amazing. Almost 400 people showed up today. And that gives me hope. You know, what gives me hope is Stephen and Akasha. Stephen talking about the money, Senator Lawrence Spence talking about the laws and things that can change. I listened to Maribel and Reyna talk about the workers, talk about the women making the change. I heard from Sky and Amber about housing and economic development and working together with multiple chambers. I heard the foundations talk about, you know, they weren't talking about 20 years ago. They weren't even talking about 10 years ago, this kind of equity, this kind of collaboration, this kind of change. So all of that gives me hope. And, you know, I will end on the fact that what gives me hope, you know, Carlos had some very powerful things to say about neighborhood partnerships and what they're doing in the community. But what gives me hope the most is my Research Justice Institute, our Research Justice Institute at CCC, who put this work together, who took the resources from the foundations, and that RJI team of Mira, Andres, and Kanya put this together for you all. So I want you all to remember that it's a strong team. We're still in the community. We're working hard for you. And we're just very grateful that we had so much support and so many of you listened. I hope you read the report, and I hope you ask any follow-ups that you need. But thanks for coming out today, and thanks for supporting CCC and the RJI team and the collaborative work that everybody that you see on this screen is doing for our community in Oregon. So thanks.